Yeah. Roberta in the truth zone, mic hitting raw. Spotlight shining, she exposing the flaw. Debunking the myth, breaking their facade. This is Glass City, respect the squad. On these NYC blocks where the skyline flex big. Roberta Glass slicing lies with a truth rig. Innocence frosters, your stories unravel. She's a map through the madness of gritty gravel. Glass don't bend and facts don't break. She's the storm that's called, you feel the quake. Exposing tales stitched with crooked seams. Justice in the lens, shattered fake dreams. Screams about killers, painted heroes in disguise. She burning propaganda with fire in her eyes. No glamour for the guilty, she call it straight. She backs victims, the voice stay awake. Stats and receipts, no spin, no clutter. Cold cases whisper, she cuts through the mutter. Truth's her tempo, don't confuse the beat. She standing for the real while you taking a seat. True crime's a block, facts the artillery. Spinning those lies, yo, she checks that misery. Tabloid tales get smashed, no time to play. She's glass hard, break the false and save the day. True crime's a block, facts the artillery. Spinning those lies, yo, she checks that misery. Tabloid tales get smashed, no time to...
Okay, here we go. How is everybody? Hey, Miss Lisa. Can everybody hear me? Wesley loves Oktoberfest. Melanie, Jack Thompson, Wesley, Ruth Lang. Who else? Who did I miss? Shivani, Kitties, Darkside. Hello, hello, hello. Let us get into it. So I'm really excited to actually come back to the subject. So I attended all of the NXIVM hearings, from the early pretrial hearings on through the plea deals, through the sentencing hearings, and much of Keith Raniere's trial. So if you don't know, NXIVM is a cult that was in Albany, New York. And the leader, Keith Raniere, said he had a 240 IQ. That IQ is actually based on one of his child victims' IQ tests, the take-home IQ test. So it was never really his own IQ. He was, I believe, in the Australian Guinness Book of World Records for highest IQ at one point, and he certainly capitalized on that. But as far as his intelligence, I would say it's probably about average. It was a lot of gobbledygook that we heard in trial and not, outside of trial. So, but one of the more remarkable things about NXIVM was just the amazing people that it recruited. One was, of course, Claire Bronfman. I'm going to just show you some of the NXIVM defendants before I start. So here are the NXIVM defendants. So this is Kathy Russell, the bookkeeper, who was convinced she could be a middle-aged ballerina. Keith Raniere in the middle. Nancy Salzman is a neurolinguistic programmer. Probably it's been called the number 2 best neurolinguistic programmer in the world. It's a kind of hypnosis with words, a painting a picture with words. And she taught much of the NXIVM curriculum, which was basically ripped off from Scientology. Here's Allison Mack. She's the subject of today's episode. Bottom left, she was an actress in Smallville, a TV show. And she, after Smallville was canceled, she moved to Albany to teach NXIVM full time and was a main recruiter and was a master in the slave master portion of NXIVM, which is where they got a lot of the trafficking, not all of them, but a lot of the trafficking charges from. In the middle is middle under Keith Raniere. So middle bottom is Lauren Salzman, who is Nancy Salzman's daughter, who was basically groomed from her mother to be with Keith Raniere, and Keith Raniere basically preyed on almost all of the women in NXIVM. It would be hard to get out of NXIVM without being preyed on by Keith Raniere. And then on the right is the Seagram heiress, Claire Bronfman. So these were the defendants, criminal defendants. It's not all of who was involved in NXIVM, it's just the criminal defendants. And since I have a view really from the courtroom of this case, I'm going to concentrate on the court case and the defense and how it went down. And as far as Allison Mack, so she's on the bottom left again for those watching now, she has come out with a new podcast on CDC, which is called Alison After NXIVM. And she's talking about her experience as DOS master and convicted felon for her crimes in Keith Raniere's NXIVM cult. The show is hosted by Natalie Robamed and Vanessa Grigoriadis. So this is notable because Vanessa Grigoriadis was handpicked to write the New York Times Magazine PR piece for the cult right before Keith Raniere got, and Allison Mack for that matter, were arrested. The piece came out after they were arrested, and the branding had made news, and so much of their charges had to do with trafficking and forced labor conspiracy. Grigoriadis' piece in the New York Times Magazine was mostly a love letter to NXIVM, citing the strong connections of the women, the intelligence of Raniere, the group's cult leader, who again boasted about his fictional IQ of 240. And it's ultimately where Mack, in that New York Times Magazine piece, took ownership of the cult's most notorious crime, which was branding women with a culturizing tool. So I had some experience with Vanessa Grigoriadis to just kind of give you a little bit of a flavor for the interviews that she was doing after this piece. She was giving interviews like this was a helpful thing. She was kind of minimizing the crimes. Wasn't really sold that this was a criminal enterprise, and NXIVM was always described in court as a criminal enterprise. But this is a good example. This is an interview that she did in July of 2018. And in it, she talks about, she really minimizes the crimes of NXIVM. So let me see if I can pull it up. Pull this out. Thank you. So this is an interview she did with Ari Cohen Wade, and you can hear the way she describes the cult and the women in it. Take a listen.
A lot of the people who joined this group were women. Is that accurate, that there was more women than men who were joining up?
Well, I don't know the exact breakdown, but I would say that there were a lot of women involved. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more women than men. The women were, to my eyes, during my reporting, much more alpha than a lot of the men who were involved, other than Keith himself, who was kind of like the ultimate alpha. There's no question that it was.
Remind me to get back to Keith being the ultimate alpha in a minute. Remind me to come back to that. I wouldn't call him the ultimate alpha, but
like
okay.
an incredibly strong group of like interwoven friendships between women, and relationships. And, you know, when I mentioned that thing of like these integrations, these ideas about experiences, one of the things that they did, just, you know, in case of Scientology auditing, this happens too, you know, members would do it to each other. Like you didn't have to only do it with a specific person who was at the very top of the group. You could just do it, you know, one-on-one. If one person was like certified in a certain way, then you could do these things together, process these memories.
And it would cost you $250 to $350, depending how experienced the person EMing you. Very, very much like going clear in Scientology without the cans. But here she mentioned Scientology, like it's just like Scientology, like, oh, this is a very normal thing, just like Scientology, which is, I consider Scientology one of our most destructive cults that we still have going in the United States. We just can't get rid of it. Really destructive cult. But you can just get a sense of the normalizing, like these great friendships, how smart everyone was, how they think. She really emphasizes how people were helped. And I had some experience with Vanessa Cordiatis. I actually went to Northwestern with her as a, when I was 16 or 17 years old, my junior summer. Uh, I didn't bring that up to her, however, in court. But I was at a sentencing hearing with Claire Bronfman where she fake fainted in order to get out of questions and delay the hearing, which worked. Like the gurney was brought in and she remarkably recovered. That's Claire Bronfman, the Seagram's heiress. And Vanessa Grigoriadis was trying to convince me that Claire Bronfman, who put hundreds of millions of dollars into NXIVM, at least $100 million into NXIVM, how Vanessa was convinced that she didn't see any of the dark side of NXIVM. And that just proved to be untrue. And much of the dark things were done by Claire Bronfman, which is why she got such a incredibly long sentence. She was able to, with her family trust fund, able to buy her buy herself a short sentence, but Judge Garifas actually gave her a 7 3/4 year sentence, which was the longest of all the people who, spoiler alert, pled out. And that's another thing that's really not clear in this podcast. So she's always been a little bit of an apologist in some ways, for NXIVM, at least in the beginning. And unfortunately, when you agree to interview a subject, so you're interviewing Allison Mack, so you want Allison Mack to tell her story for Access, there's a kind of complicity that you'll publish something very favorable to Allison Mack. And this is what they've published is a multi-part apologist piece for Allison Mack and her part in NXIVM. And it's, so if you're looking for Mack to express real remorse for her part in NXIVM recruitment, trafficking, and abuse of women, you will be sorely disappointed. Mack at times admits to her bad acts, but always couples it with the idea that she thought she was doing good. Apparently, Allison Mack has never heard the phrase from good intentions, right? The worst things come from good intentions. Living full-time at the cult's Albany headquarters, Mack can't deny that she saw an awful lot of disturbing things being done to people and did many of those things herself, especially to other women. Mack seems to want to marry her story with the second in power, Nancy Salzman's daughter, Lauren's story. The podcast starts at Allison Mack's sentencing. And the podcasters point out how Allison Mack was prey to the paparazzi, but I too attended that sentencing, and the courtroom never filled to capacity. By the time Allison Mack was sentenced, it had been so delayed by the pandemic. And so she was finally sentenced on June 30th of 2021. NXIVM was old news, and her 3-year prison sentence was pretty much a gift, considering she was at one time facing charges that could have seen her cooling her heels in prison for 4 decades. The podcasters make a point to note that Nancy Salzman's daughter, Lauren Salzman, received no jail time for her part in NXIVM. Well, Allison Mack is and was no Lauren Salzman when it came to NXIVM. She was neither groomed by her mother into a relationship with Raniere. She didn't come by it by family. And the depths of depravity, I would say Allison Mack's depths of depravity were much deeper and more disturbing. The podcast depiction of Mack's sentencing is nothing short of cringy. Mack hopes for no prison time, gets 3, and feels terrible, not for the victims who gave victim impact statement, but she feels terrible for her family having to listen to her victims' remarks about her terrible character. She says, quote, they, meaning her family, are innocent. I am not. 2 of Mack's victims gave statements at her sentencing hearing. One was Jess, who gave victim impact statements in person, and Tabitha gave her victim impact statement by video, but the podcast only mentions the former. And that's pretty much, and it's pretty much all downhill from there. At times it seems Allison Mack even revels in her bad girl past, announcing that she did the very bad things she was accused of. Kind of almost like bragging, like at times she says, I'm not innocent, I'm not innocent. Other times she seems bewildered by the venom towards her and seems to want to minimize the depravity of her crimes. They depict one long proffer session with Allison Mack, where Allison Mack employs her lawyers, just tell me what to say and I'll say it. Allison Mack, ever the actress, looking for her lines. And if Allison Mack, but the fact that Allison Mack hasn't any remorse for her behavior or any real insight into isn't the most disappointing thing in the podcast. The most truly repellent thing about this podcast is its total insistence on rewriting NXIVM history. And so what it does is, it starts at her sentencing, and then it goes into Keith Raniere's arrest, and then it goes into Keith Raniere's trial, and it depicts Allison Mack having to make this decision at Keith Raniere's trial whether she's going to plead guilty. She offered to give evidence, but everything that Allison Mack had to give was not very helpful to the prosecution, unlike Lauren Salzman, who actually gave really strong testimony and seemed to understand that she was involved in a dangerous cult immediately. And it's an interesting part where Allison Mack talks about being warned by Lauren Salzman to get out. And Allison Mack, I think it just in an ultimate act of in resilience, agrees to get out, but she's still not incredibly helpful to the prosecution, so she's never called to testify. But what it leaves out is the whole order of how all these things went down. I hope I'm not losing everybody. I know this very well. I know you guys don't. But so here, just to go in order to give you like a little bit of a timeline. This is sorely missing from this podcast. So on March 26, 2018, Keith Raniere is arrested in Mexico. And So back to him being an alpha guy. Lauren Salzman tells the story about they're all about to have this kind of group, you know, how do I say this in a friendly way? Menage, I guess, together and redevote their life to Keith Raniere. But Keith Raniere feels a little ill and lies down. And when they get up to make food for him, the police come and Keith Raniere hides in a closet. And Lauren Salzman is facing the Mexican police with guns at her and is calling for Keith Raniere, and he couldn't care less. And that's when she realized it was all about Keith Raniere. So I wouldn't call him an alpha man. And one of the more fascinating things in this podcast is Lauren Salzman admitting that Keith Raniere wanted every other defendant to take the hit for his crimes, basically take responsibility, which calls into question whether Allison Mack really did take responsibility for the branding totally, like that was totally her own idea and not suggested by Raniere in any kind of hypnotic way or direct way. So after Keith Raniere is arrested in March 26th of 2019, then we have Allison Mack is arrested the next month, April 20th of 2018. And then we have these group arrests of Claire Bronfman, Kathy Russell, the bookkeeper, Nancy Salzman to the right, and her daughter Lauren Salzman. So they were arrested July 24th, 2018. But so the way that this podcast creates a kind of dramatic arc is they say, well, Allison has got to wake. When is she going to wake up? Keith Raniere is already in trial, and is she going to plead guilty? What is she going to do? But the big kicker, I hate to spoil it for you guys, but Nancy Salzman pled guilty, the number 2 in NXIVM, on March 13th, 2019. So that like basically kicked off where they all just started pleading guilty, one after the other, everyone but Keith Raniere, who went to trial. So there was no great dilemma that Allison Mack had during Keith Raniere's trial, certainly. She had already pled out and had a sentencing date, which got way pushed back due to the pandemic. And that's what happened with most of the defendants in this. It took, through 2020, 2021 for everybody to get sentenced in this case. So it's just a very odd experience to listen to this just being totally rewritten. So after her mom, so Nancy Salzman got the best deal. She was the most complicit. She had a big shoebox full of cash at her house that they found. But she pled guilty before the superseding indictment came down. So the really serious charges concerning children came down. And that was very helpful to her getting a very short sentence. Then her daughter pled out on March 28th, 2019. And then finally, April 7th, 2019, Allison Mack pleads guilty. And April 19th, Claire Bronfman and Kathy Russell pled guilty. I was there for that day. Allison Mack and Lauren Salzman pled guilty kind of in secret. It wasn't announced, so I just couldn't get there. Most people weren't there for that because it was done pretty much in secret, is my memory of it. But Kathy Russell and Claire Bronfman pled guilty on the same day, April 19th, 2019. So that should give you like a little bit of a better sense for those of you who want to listen to the CBC podcast of how this went down. So the only one who didn't plead guilty, let me just remove this and take some of these out. I have so many of these. Was Keith Raniere, who opening statement started May 7th, 2019. And I hope this gives people just a better sense of where we're going here. And then he was found guilty July 19th, 2019. And ultimately, he was sentenced. Let's see if I can bring this in. Hold on one second. Ultimately, he was sentenced October 20th, 2020. So by the time Allison Mack had gotten sentenced, it was like really old news by that time. I mean, she was one of the last people to get sentenced in this. I think only Nancy Salzman was after her in September. But in June 30th, 2021, Allison was sentenced to 3 years. And here's my take. We can listen to it together on Allison Mack's sentencing. And hold on one second. What I saw, which was, she said all the right things, but it was very empty. That's all I could say. But I would have to say that after listening to this podcast, I have a worse sense of her. She talks about in this podcast a real hatred towards, or a real jealousy towards women, and a real aggression towards women, a real need to control not only men, but women. And she talks about being frustrated, not being able to control women. And you get the feeling that she might still be a very dangerous person. I did, certainly listening to it. I mean, I was waiting for her to have some feeling for any of her victims or any of her victims' parents. I mean, I'll remember the victims' parents just sobbing, like their shoulders just sobbing in the row in front of me in court, having to listen what Allison Mack and Keith Raniere did to their daughters. And for Allison Mack, it's all poor me. No one likes me now. My name has been ruined. The paparazzi came after me. And it's like, if you're waiting for the part, it never gets to the part where there's any kind of remorse. But here's I called this the unbearable lightness of Allison Mack's sentence. And there are a few errors in this, and I'll stop it and correct them when I get to it.
Having covered this story from the early hearings, Mack has remained an enigma. Early on in the story, the most remarkable thing about the Smallville actress was her appearance. I couldn't take my eyes off Mack's frail body and sallow complexion that appeared both gray and yellow. Mack has been a question mark in the NXIVM story. Was she a victim of Keith Raniere or a soulmate? A psychopath or an empath captured in the grips of a monster?
So this is one of the things that Allison Mack says. So my parents and my brother have to listen to this victim say that I'm basically a monster. Well, you did monstrous things, Allison. What do you think they're going to listen to from a victim impact statement about your behavior? Why is it so? Why do you feel so badly for your? It's shame. I see that as shame. She's being shamed in front of her parents, and this real ego and need to be the best and need to be in control certainly comes. You can't miss it in this podcast as part of Allison Mack's personality. I need to be seen as better, more talented. I need to grab attention. At one point, she says near the end of the podcast, well, maybe I should just play it small so at least I'll know I'm not hurting someone. That's a paraphrase. And it's like she's waiting for the podcasters to say, "Oh no, Allison, you can't play it small. You're much too talented and wonderful to ever play it small. You have way too many talents." And they say nothing. And then she goes on to say, "Well, I can't play it small." Meaning like I'm just it's not in me to play it small. I have to play it big. I have to do big things with my life because, I'm such an ultra special, and the ego comes through, and the ego of her new husband is something we can talk about too.
A narcissistic abuser who found satisfaction as DOS slave master, NXIVM's secret sex master-slave sorority, or a brainwashed true believer. The court answered those questions at today's sentencing hearing with a resounding yes. She was what Judge Garifas described as an essential accomplice in NXIVM's most serious crimes of sex trafficking and a branded slave herself. So she was all those things at once. I met Stanley Zaroff in the courthouse cafeteria. Zaroff is a communications and media consultant, a family friend to Catherine and India Oxenberg, as well as Tony Natale. Featured in HBO's documentary The Vow, Zaroff has been in the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse for nearly every NXIVM-related legal proceeding. He has an awesome talent for summing up the characters and courtroom events in a short but funny and always insightful, dead-on comment. When Allison Mack walked in a black suit, Stanley immediately whispered to me about her full face of makeup, false eyelashes, and salon blown-out hair. This choice of outfit seemed odd for someone who might have to surrender themselves to federal custody at the end of the proceedings. I assumed today's sentencing hearing would be not unlike Claire Bronfman's and Keith Raniere's, long and crowded with lots of victim impact statements read, both in person and in video. Instead, the room never filled to capacity. There was no metal detectors placed in front of the courtroom as a secondary security precaution, as there had been at the other sentencings of Claire Bronfman and Keith Raniere. No one cares enough to kill her, I thought to myself. And only one victim, Jennifer Jones, showed up in person, making the sentencing hearing.
This is just drives me crazy. This is Jessica Jones. I called her Jennifer, and I'm very sorry, Jessica.
Very short. Joan described Mack as a psychopath, going on to say, quote, Keith Raniere and Allison Mack are two of the most evil monsters I've ever met. She went on to describe how Mack exploited Joan's past history of sexual abuse and assigned her the task of seducing Keith Raniere as a way to overcome it.
Right. So why did Allison Mack never woke up to the fact that every assignment was to seduce Keith Raniere? So this isn't the only woman who had this assignment. It was like every assignment, whether it was India Oxenberg or someone else, it was always to do something sexual that benefited Keith Raniere. Like, she didn't see. She was like, I was really naive. I have trouble believing she was that naive. I mean, women were forced to run into trees purposely. Was it drink from puddles? That's my memory of it. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But just like the most degrading, horrendous things, starving themselves, branding themselves. And Allison Mack is looking around thinking this is a great group. And I get that she was on a low-calorie diet. I understand how brainwashing works. But my experience with cults is that, or my understanding from covering two cold course cases, Larry Ray and the NXIVM case, and studying other cults, is that it just seems like the leader has an understanding of what each person is capable of and will exploit it. And he obviously saw something in Allison Mack, Keith Raniere did, that was capable of all this. And she certainly was. She's really cruel. And I'll get into her new husband in a second. But
the way she looked into my eyes made me feel seen. She saw the little Jess inside me and exploited it, unquote. Joan went on to call Mack, quote, an evil sociopath, a menace to society, and a dangerous human being, unquote. She went on to warn the court that Mack, quote, plays the victim so well. Joan stood alone in her certainty that Mack was a
victimizer. And boy, after listening to this podcast, I say Joan was right on the money. It is what this podcast is a multi-part apologist piece for Allison Mack. And Allison Mack plays the victim throughout. It's like, no, and her mother, oh my law, her mother was taking some of these classes and said, it really helped my mother. I mean, she says at one point, let me see if I can get I know I wrote down the quote. It was so unreal. She says, I've always really wanted to help women. Like I've always felt if a really weird, ugly feeling of competition in my own heart towards women. That's one of the things that's obvious by her crimes. But she also says of her mother, it's so confusing because like my mom came to she means in Jeunesse, that was the name of the all-woman group, Jeunesse. So my mom came to the intensives. She still says so much of what I learned there has made my marriage better. Like we were really doing good. When a cult makes this much destruction, any good is like, it pales in comparison to the amount of destruction it caused. The fact that Allison Mack still wants to argue that people learned things or got things that were good out of this is such a red flag to me.
Victimizer, not a victim. Tabitha, who worked as Mack's assistant in exchange for NXIVM classes, gave a video statement that extolled both Mack's generosity and vindictiveness. Tabitha said she still has dreams of her former boss and friend. Quote, in some of my dreams, I'm running from you. In other dreams, I'm running towards you, feeling a sense of comfort, unquote, before concluding that those dreams, quote, represent the paradox of the relationship, unquote. When it came time for Allison Mack's attorney, Sean Buckley, to argue that she should get no prison time, his presentation acknowledged both the harm she caused her victims and the power of Raniere's influence. When Raniere's influence was brought up, it was quickly followed by the sentence, quote, this is not an excuse. It was about as brilliant a presentation as a defense lawyer could make for such a defendant. With that said, Mack had done all the right things in the 3 years on home confinement in her parents' house to shorten her sentence. She had graduated from college with straight A's, worked a catering job, and publicly denounced Raniere and all his teachings. She offered the government an audio recording of Raniere masterminding DOS that was played in his trial.
So this is untrue. This is what they said in court, but it happens to be totally untrue. So this recording of Allison Mack, and let me just stop here and play it, was actually given, and this is a really important point of the podcast where they say, well, Allison handed over this really devastating audio clip of Raniere talking about the branding ceremony, and you can clearly see it's not her idea, though she is collaborating with Raniere in it. This was given by India Oxenberg, who had to pack up Allison Mack's stuff. India Oxenberg is the one who handed this over, not Allison Mack. So another, I mean, I fell for the propaganda. I fell for the propaganda from her lawyer in that hearing. It just happens to be totally untrue. And
if you're interested in NXIVM, I would encourage you, I'm not to watch The Vow, but to watch Seduced. I think it's the much stronger of the two documentaries that have been produced about this cult, and much more realistic. But here's a little of the tape.
Allison.
I mean, this is so disturbing. So Keith Raniere liked to go on these walks. So here's Keith Raniere and Allison Mack on a walk, deciding how the rest of the women are going to be branded with a cauterizing tool. And this didn't wake her up. It's called Seduced. Melanie? Audrey, you got it? Hey, Dean. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
What's the date? The 10th. No, the 9th. January 9th, 6:59 a.m. talking about branding on a walk.
So, I think doing the actual brand in an orderly fashion, each of the 7 strokes having a certain ritualization, maybe each of the strokes has something that's said with them.
And this is the weird thing about this brand, and I'm not going to bring it up just because it's so horribly disturbing. But it has Keith Raniere's initials. You can clearly see it in it, and Allison Mack's initials. And Allison Mack is still denying that it's her initials are in it, and that it was 7 strokes and some, Eastern symbols. Hard to believe when you look at it. I encourage people to look up Allison Mack branding or NXIVM brand, Allison Mack's initials. But Keith Raniere in this, he says, when Vanessa Gregoriadis asked him about the brand and his initials in it, he says, well, what would the public say if they wanted, and I think this is a very compelling analogy he makes here. What would the public do if the women had Albert Einstein's initials? Albert Einstein, largely considered one of the world's smartest men, a little bit like the fake persona Keith Raniere took on, people wouldn't be bothered by it. So, I mean, essentially he's saying, because I'm the world's smartest man, that's my persona, they shouldn't be bothered by it. It's just that I'm controversial, right? And I have all these forces. He always had this kind of conspiracy theories that he tried to sell his devotees, that the whole world was so against him. And he was such a rebel because his ideas were so powerful.
And maybe repeated after the stroke is done.
So like somebody says the thing while the stroke is being done, and then the person that's getting it done repeats it afterwards?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, you guys come up with something and propose it to me.
Okay.
Well, because you've done it, so what would have been most meaningful, deep, surrendering, focusing for you?
I think it probably having it whispered in my ear and then me repeating it out loud. And then having it whispered in my ear and then me repeating it out loud.
Well, ask the others. It's not all you.
Oh, I thought you were asking me.
No, I said all of you guys who've gone through it.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, so much. I mean, Patricia Burns asked a good question. Why did these gorgeous looking women and talented, so many of them, especially thinking of Danny, who was forced to live in a room with almost nothing in it for a year plus for the crime of having feelings for another man that wasn't Raniere. So talented, so brilliant. She was really the genius. And she would read all of Keith Raniere's books and give him cliff notes and ideas. But what Keith Raniere did was he would look in these women's eyes and he would listen. He also used a lot of hypnosis.
and manipulation. And coupled with all these props that with Claire Bronfman's money, that he was the smartest man with all the answers. And that's something that is discussed in this podcast, that Allison Mack loved having all the answers to life's problems from NXIVM and felt very lost when she realized it was, I'm not sure she has realized it's all a scam. At the end, she says, well, I just have to separate the good things from NXIVM that I learned it from the bad things. Like, it's so easy. But it all comes from this really evil psychopath. So I would say it's all bad things. I would say trash it all. I'd say start over. She's like, well, he you know, don't consider it as something you learned from NXIVM. If he stole it, Keith Raniere stole a lot of his, almost all of his ideas, everything. And if it's somewhere else, take it from somewhere else, but don't say you learned it from NXIVM, because it's just, it's so much destruction this cult caused. So there's like a little bit of a break here.
The other thing is, you guys did it and you weren't completely because you had a outsider and a guy doing it or whatever. Do you think the person who's being should be completely and sort of held to the table like a sort of almost like a sacrifice? I don't know if that's a feeling of submission, you know?
Right. How can I make it more degrading for all the women involved? And Allison Mack was like, yeah, how can I help? She heard this and she was like, how can I help?
So let's be fun, huh?
Yeah.
It also, of course, videoing it from different angles or whatever gives collateral.
Mm-hmm. Right. So a lot of what he's talking about here is making it so it can be legal. So asking the women, please brand me, it would be an honor, all those things. He thinks that's giving consent. And then videoing it would also keep them quiet, because DOS worked on this kind of collateral where they gave up things that, if they would be revealed, would be highly damaging. Often pictures, compromising pictures. It could be one of the women, and whose parents I'm really thinking of, who just were just devastated. She was an actress who got recruited into NXIVM by Allison Mack. She wrote a thing that was untrue things about her family, but things that would devastate them. So it worked on this kind of coercion, but he's always trying to kind of get around the law and try to say that they consented. And that's what the original reporting on this, Joe Rogan came out and said, well, how do we know that this isn't a club of women who like to do this? And Vanessa Gregoriadis, her reporting was very similar. Like, women are getting things out of this. This is good. They want to do it. Like, they're in there voluntarily. And I think she would have a hard time arguing that now. There's just so much coercion. I mean, she was really Vanessa Gregoriadis was really a mouthpiece for NXIVM in the early days.
So it probably should be a more vulnerable position type of a thing. Back, legs spread straight, like feet being held to the side of the table, hands probably above the head being held, almost like tied down, like a sacrificial whatever. And the person should ask to be branded.
Okay.
Should say, please brand me, it would be an honor, or something like that. And an honor I want to wear for the rest of my life. I don't know.
Okay.
And they should probably say that before they're held down. So it doesn't seem like they're being coerced.
Okay.
So it doesn't seem like they are, even though they are.
I don't know. Those are just thoughts.
Okay.
Those are just my thoughts. I mean, the fact that you wouldn't run screaming after that walk, right, is remarkable. And she was so much a part of this DOS, being a master in DOS, was constant demands to those that were under you, and readiness drills, and I mean, just keeping them constantly at edge and serving. And this must have given Allison Mack a real feeling of power. I don't know. So much of what I heard in court, it was like you'd hear Raniere's gobbledygook, and part of you would think, how did this guy lead anything? I mean, when he first came into the early hearings, he had dyed his hair black, and the rumor was that he dyed his hair black with ballpoint pens. So it was this kind of like he had this real like Manson-esque look, like real madman look with his hair, like this kind of the blackest Elvis black hair that didn't reflect light. But by the time of his trial, he was cleaned up in the kind of Menendez pastel sweaters. But you'd listen to him talk and you'd think, this is just gobbledygook. How did anyone fall for this? But you'd also hear him say things that were super disturbing and wonder why people didn't head for the hills. And his interest in children was not hidden from these women. And the fact that they all thought it was okay, I don't know. I mean, there's a reason. I mean, 120 years, they didn't just like hand it. So Keith Raniere was represented by Mark Agnefello, who was P. Diddy's lawyer. And you saw what he did with the P. Diddy case. I never thought he was all that great a lawyer, frankly. But Keith Raniere was really running his defense. But he still got 120 years with multi-million-dollar defense. So that will tell you how incredibly heinous these crimes were. And when Claire Bronfman, again, I'll say it again, made a deal with the government where she paid like a great amount of restitution to the government for a smaller sentence, the judge Garifas was like, no thanks. 7 3/4 years for you. This thing was heinous. So the most shocking thing was when it came to Allison Mack, who was so involved in some of the most exploitative parts of, and most disturbing parts of NXIVM, that she got away with 3 years. Because you can listen on the podcast as to, she tried to help the government, but it seems like she was just way too still brainwashed to help them at all. And the really compelling question in the whole NXIVM saga is, if Allison Mack hadn't left or gotten arrested and had her stuff kind of sent to her, I believe that, I may be wrong on the circumstances of that, had to leave the apartment that she shared with because she got arrested by the feds, and then she moved to her parents' house on home confinement. Had she not done that, and had she discovered this tape herself, would she have handed it into the feds? Because it's not just terribly damaging for Keith Raniere, it's terribly damaging for herself. But she often gets credit for that, handing in that tape, and not so. I mean, once the number 2 went down, so once Nancy Salzman pled out, they all were like, we're all guilty. We're all doing the best for ourselves. Like, it gave permission to everyone to plead out. So to obscure that fact is really to just rewrite the whole NXIVM history. So let me finally get into, so So they have Allison Mack. Basically, they have her have this dilemma. She doesn't know whether she finally pleads guilty and decides to help the government, but she had done all that, by her sentencing, but during Keith Raniere's trial, et cetera, et cetera. And she goes to prison. She says, well, at her sentencing, she says, well, I really hope for no prison time, but I can do 5 years. No problem, like standing on my head. And her prison time sounds quite pleasant, frankly. She says, like, I ate a lot of prison cheesecake, and I woke up at 6 a.m. and I was out in the yard alone, and I picked flowers. And she makes it. And then she says, well, when I was about to be released, I thought, oh no, I have to get out of prison and deal with the real world. It seemed like the real world was more daunting than prison. So I'm not sure how much of a punishment it was, or if she learned anything from prison. But it goes on to her taking master's classes. Apparently she wants to change careers and be a social worker, where she'll have more power and influence over people, which I find frightening. Allison Mack having control of anyone's lives again. It certainly wouldn't be a social worker I would want for me or any one of my loved ones. But she meets Frank Mink, who I had read his book a long time ago called Memoirs of a Recovering Skinhead. So he was a neo-Nazi who had kidnapped someone by gunpoint, and then American History X, some of his story made it into American History X, that movie, if you've seen that movie. So then he goes to prison, where he befriends some black men and plays sports with them, and then leaves prison and works for a Jewish man and becomes de-radicalized, and essentially ends up being a kind of a lecturer and de-escalating or de-radicalizing people and anti-racism kind of things. He's also very he's also talks about warns people about the radicalization of the police, very, very left wing. And Allison Mack says in this podcast that she wants to do prison reform. So we may see a collaboration with the Innocence Project and Allison Mack soon. So it seems like, having met this guy becomes her husband, Frank Mink. And he says, well, people warned me, like my friends warned me about her, saying that maybe she was another Ghislaine Maxwell. And I said, no, nothing. This wasn't that kind of thing. It wasn't. I think he uses correct me if I'm wrong. Deviant. He uses the phrase the word deviant. Nothing Allison Mack did was deviant. I don't know what research Frank Mink did, but what Allison Mack took part in NXIVM was so deviant. It was the definition of deviant. I don't know what what research he's doing or what idea he has about the cult, because he's just seen the vow, which leaves a lot on the cutting room floor. And so it's like she's found another egotistical, kind of like the AA speaker personality, a guy who wants to kind of like stand up and brag about how he's got it all figured out. Like they've gone from one extreme philosophy to the next with zero kind of self-reflection. And I'm curious to see if this marriage is going to last. Let me see if I can share a picture of him. Pull it up. Hold on one second. It's it's just curious that they're not asking. Hold on one sec. Is my screen frozen? Okay, here we go. It's just curious that they're not more self-reflective, especially having adopted such a radical philosophy so easily, that neither Frank nor her husband Frank nor Allison herself is skeptical at all about the ideology that they're adopting, whether it's prison reform or Allison Mack talks about being in classes and about how the other students feel unsafe in her classes, and how she was in a Black Studies class and she was told not to talk. Like, are they bringing back racial divide in classrooms now? So none of the white students can talk in class? And she didn't question it. And instead, she just wrote down everything they said and then presented their quotes on a presentation, read it out loud, and put their quotes on a heart, like, you've captured my heart. Like, what a superficial, cheesy, manipulative presentation. I don't know. So there's Frank Mink on the right. And so now, not only is he lecturing on anti-racism, he's now converted to pretty strict Judaism. And they had a Jewish wedding. So, I mean, they take it to extremes. It'll be interesting to see what happens with those two. So do I have anything else I want to say? Does anybody have any questions before I go? I mean, that's kind of I think I hit there's two other points that I want to hit. There's, when I was going to the early hearings, they would come in, all the NXIVM defendants would come in, like, they would come in just like joking and laughing. And I would look at them and I would think they have no idea what they're up against. Like, they seemed really out of it and really unaware that they were facing decades of prison time, or didn't care or didn't take it seriously. And that is confirmed in this podcast. Allison Mack talks about how she thinks it's just going to be straightened out any minute. Another thing that I observed from Allison Mack in those early hearings is that she looked her skin had a kind of gray and yellow pallor that I've never seen before in a human being. And she talks about eating a 500-calorie diet of heavy on squash that turned her skin orange. I didn't see orange. I saw yellow. But her mom is just a very interesting, kind of very narcissistic figure, and talks about India Oxenberg's mom, Catherine Oxenberg, doing all these interviews and exposing the cult and getting her daughter out. And while her mother never did it, instead her mother is taking, more and more classes with her and never wants to kind of criticize Allison Mack because she's afraid that she's going to just go further into the cult. And it's a kind of cowardness and lack of courage that's hard to overlook. And the fact that she's still talking about all the good, all the good in NXIVM, seems like they're both in La La Land when it comes to this cult. So be warned. Be warned. She's out there and she's very dangerous. I don't know. That's what I got from this podcast. And I don't know, I understand it's a process, waking up to a cult, but I think Allison Mack's personality and the fact that she's learned very little makes her incredibly dangerous. So that is what I have for today. Which one is her mom? I think I showed her mom. Hold on one second. When she pled out. Hold on one sec. I'll pull it up. I think I have a picture of Allison Mack when here she is. So on her sentencing.
So that's her and the gray hair and the mask. But she had a huge group of people supporting her. That is true. Yeah, Catherine Oxenberg was fantastic. She helped bring down the cult, Patricia. But not so much Allison Mack's mother. She stayed silent. So. So that is what I have for today, guys. Yeah, that listen at your own peril. It's certainly a rewriting of NXIVM history, and it looks like Allison Mack is staging a big comeback. That's what it sounds like. Okay, so stay tuned. Stay tuned for more of Allison Mack and her apology tour. Her I didn't know what I did was wrong. I really thought I was doing good tour. But then at other times she's like, yeah, I did a lot of bad. I was almost proud of it. It's an odd listen. All right. Have a great one, everybody. Please hit the thumbs up on your way out. Share this episode. I'll be back very shortly. Have a great night, everybody.
Mic check, Roberta strides through the static haze. True crime Gotham where the shadows play their plays. Fraudsters fold when a spotlight beams. Fact-focused queen busting propaganda schemes. Glass shatter lies echoes through the streets. Standing for victims, giving voice their beats. NYC Pulse, truth sharp as night. Roberta exposing, she's the anti-fraud light. Hard task warrior, dissecting state and defense. Twisted innocence, claims breaking pretense. Gotham's truth seeker cuts clean with the blade. Facts in the forefront, no justice gets swayed. Cold facts drip heavy, real talk unfurls. Cracking cases open like oysters with pearls. Innocence gimmicks crumble to dust in the wind. For victims, her creed, justice till the end. Headphones blazing, she drops heavy artillery. Narratives twisted, meet blunt object civility. Roberta got receipts that unravel the ploy. Exposing the lies these fraudsters deploy. Glass shatters lies, echoes through the streets. Standing for victims, giving voice their beats. NYC Pulse, truth sharp as night. Roberta exposing, she's the anti-fraud light.